My name is Rosalind Booker, and I am 76 years old. I am telling this story because silence almost buried me alive. The night they gathered in my living room, smiling and whispering, I finally understood something I had ignored for years. They were not waiting for my love anymore. They were waiting for my death. And the moment they opened the envelope they thought would make them rich, that was the moment their faces broke. Before I take you back to that night, let me ask you something. If you enjoy emotional, powerful stories about family, truth, and quiet strength, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and turn on your notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from? I want to know who is here with me. Now listen closely. Because what I did with my will changed everything. They were all sitting there. My son, my daughter, their spouses, even 2 grandchildren who barely spoke to me anymore. They sat on my couches like guests waiting for dessert, eyes shining, hands folded, pretending to care. My son cleared his throat and said, "Mom, are you sure you're feeling okay?" I smiled. "I'm fine," I said. But my heart was pounding. Because they thought this meeting was about my health. They thought it was about money. They had no idea it was about truth. Let me take you back. Years before that night, I started to notice the change. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. The phone calls became shorter. The visits became rare. The hugs felt rushed. But every time money came up, suddenly everyone remembered my name. "Mom, do you need help with your bills? Grandma, have you updated your will? You should really make sure everything is clear." Clear. That word kept coming up. And slowly, painfully, I realized they weren't worried about my peace. They were worried about my things. I raised my children with everything I had. Not just money. Time. Love. Sacrifice. I worked 2 jobs when their father left. I skipped meals so they could eat. I wore the same coat for 10 winters so they could have new shoes. And I never complained. I thought that meant something. But as I got older, I became inconvenient. I walked slower. I forgot small things. I asked for help sometimes. And kindness changed into impatience. My daughter once sighed loudly and said, "Mom, we've explained this already." My son laughed one day and said, "You're too old to worry about this stuff." Too old. Those words sting deeper than people realize. The first time they mentioned the will, I was still strong. Still driving. Still cooking. Still living alone. "Just to be safe," they said. "Just in case." I nodded. I listened. And that was my first mistake. Over time, they started acting like my life was already over. They argued about who would get the house, while I was sitting right there. They joked about when Grandma's gone, like I couldn't hear. One day, my granddaughter whispered to her brother, "Soon this will all be ours." She didn't know I heard her. I did not cry. I did not yell. I started watching. I noticed who visited when I was sick. No one. I noticed who showed up when my pension came in late. Everyone. That's when the quiet plan formed in my heart. Not revenge. Preparation. I began writing things down. Dates. Words. Moments. I wrote how often they called. What they said. What they didn't say. I asked myself a hard question one night, sitting alone in my kitchen. If I had nothing to give, would they still love me? The answer hurt. But it was clear. So I made a decision. I would write a will. A real one. Not the one they expected. Not the one they kept hinting at. But one that told the truth. I didn't tell them right away. I took my time. I watched them rush. They grew impatient. My son asked one afternoon, "Mom, have you finished the will yet?" I looked at him and said softly, Almost. That word made them restless. Almost. The day I finally called them together, they came quickly. Too quickly. They dressed nicely. Smiled too much. Brought flowers that still had price tags on them. My daughter hugged me and said, "Whatever you decide, Mom, we love you." I smiled back. "We'll see," I said quietly. They didn't notice my hands shaking. They didn't notice the envelope on the table. They didn't notice the weight in the room. They thought the will would make them rich. They didn't know it would make them cry. As my son reached for the envelope and said, "Mom, should I read it?" I looked at all of them. Every face. Every expectation. And I said the one sentence that made the room go silent. "No," I said. "Let me read it." Their smiles faded. And as I opened my mouth to speak, I saw fear. Real fear. Because they were about to hear the truth. And nothing would ever be the same again. Before I continue this story, kindly subscribe, like, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. When I said, "Let me read it," the room went quiet in a way I had never heard before. Not respectful quiet. Nervous quiet. My son's hand froze in the air. My daughter's smile slipped just a little. One of my grandchildren shifted in their seat, suddenly uncomfortable. I took a slow breath. I needed it. Because this was not just a piece of paper in my hands. This was my life. But before I read a single word, my mind drifted back to how we got here. Because people don't wake up one day and become strangers to their own family. It happens slowly. Like erosion. Years ago, when my husband was still alive, the house was loud. Children running. Doors slamming. Laughter echoing down the hallway. Even when money was tight, there was warmth. After he passed, everything changed. The house grew quieter. So did my children. They still came around, but it felt different. Like they were visiting a place, not a person. At first, I told myself it was just life. They were busy. They had families. They had responsibilities. I understood that. Or at least, I told myself I did. But then I started noticing patterns. When I called just to talk, they were busy. When I called about a small problem, they sighed. When I called about money or paperwork, they answered fast. Very fast. One afternoon, I slipped in the kitchen and bruised my hip badly. I called my daughter. No answer. I called my son. Straight to voicemail. I sat on the floor for nearly an hour before I could pull myself up. That night, no one checked on me. But 2 weeks later, when I mentioned my pension paperwork was confusing, they were at my door the next day. Smiling. Concerned. Helpful. That was when something inside me cracked. Not loudly. Quietly. I started paying attention to the words they used. "Mom, you should let us handle this. You're too stressed. You've done enough, let us take over." Take over. Those words were wrapped in kindness, but they felt like hands closing around my life. The first time my daughter asked me how much the house was worth, I laughed. "Why do you need to know that?" I asked. She shrugged. "Just curious," she said. But her eyes told a different story. Soon, the will became a regular topic. Not urgent, but persistent. Just to be safe. Just to avoid problems later. "We don't want to fight when you're gone." That sentence hurt more than they knew. Because it told me something. They were already imagining life without me. One day, my granddaughter asked bluntly, "Grandma, do you get to choose who gets what?" I smiled. "Yes," I said. She nodded thoughtfully, like she was calculating something. That was the night I sat alone at my kitchen table and cried. Not because I was dying, but because I felt invisible. I felt like a wallet with a heartbeat. So I made a decision. I would not rush. I would not argue. I would observe. And I would prepare. I started keeping a small notebook. Nothing fancy. Just dates and notes. Called daughter, no answer. Son visited, asked about house. Grandchildren stayed 10 minutes. I didn't write out of anger. I wrote for clarity. As time passed, the visits became more frequent. But not warmer. They brought groceries and questions. They fixed small things and asked about documents. They hugged me and glanced around the house like they were already dividing it. One evening, my son said casually, "When the house is ours, we should repaint." I laughed softly. "It's still my house," I said. He laughed too, but it sounded forced. That was the moment I knew. They were no longer seeing me as alive. Just temporary. So I went to update my will. Alone. I did not tell them. I sat with the papers for days before writing anything. Because this wasn't about punishment. It was about honesty. I asked myself hard questions. Who showed up when I was sick? Who listened when I was scared? Who treated me like I mattered without asking for anything? The answers surprised me. And they hurt. The people who cared the most were not the ones who shared my last name. It was the neighbor who checked on me every morning. The church woman who brought soup without being asked. The young man who helped me carry groceries and never asked for a thing. They treated me like a person, not a prize. And so I wrote my will. Slowly, carefully, with intention. Now, back in the living room, the envelope felt heavy in my hands. My daughter cleared her throat. "Mom," she said gently, "are you sure you want to read it? We can help." I looked at her. "I am sure," I said. My son tried to smile. "Whatever you want, Mom," he said. But his knee was bouncing. Nervous. I unfolded the first page. The paper trembled slightly. Not because I was afraid, but because this mattered. I took a breath and began to read. "My name is Rosalind Booker," I said slowly. Their faces relaxed. They expected numbers. Property. Money. They didn't expect truth. And as I continued reading, I saw confusion creep into their eyes. Because the will was not starting the way they thought it would. And what came next would change everything they believed about me. Before I continue this story, kindly subscribe, like, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. "My name is Rosalind Booker," I read slowly, my voice steady even though my heart was beating fast. "I am 76 years old, and I am of sound mind." My son nodded slightly, like he was relieved to hear that part. My daughter leaned back into the couch, her shoulders relaxing. They thought this would be simple, quick, clean. I paused. The room was so quiet, I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Then I continued. "This will is not written out of anger. It is written out of truth." That sentence made my daughter sit up straight. "What does that mean?" she asked with a small laugh. I didn't answer. I kept reading. For many years, I believed that love meant giving without question. I believed that being a good mother meant staying quiet, staying strong, and never complaining. My son shifted in his seat. My granddaughter frowned. I could see it in their faces now. This was not what they expected. "As I have grown older," I continued, "I have learned something painful but important. I have learned that some people stop seeing you as a person when they think your time is almost done." My daughter opened her mouth. "Mom," she started. I raised my hand gently. "Please," I said, "let me finish." She closed her mouth. I went on. "I have watched the way conversations changed, how visits became shorter, how concern only came when money or property was mentioned." The air in the room felt heavy now. My son laughed nervously. "Mom, you're reading too much into things," he said. I looked at him. "I'm reading exactly what I lived," I replied. That shut him up. I continued reading. There were days I was sick and alone, days I needed help and received silence, and there were days when paperwork or money was involved, and suddenly I was not forgotten. My granddaughter looked down at her hands. My daughter crossed her arms. I do not write this to hurt anyone, I read. I write it so that no one can say they did not know how I felt. My voice cracked a little there. I stopped for a moment and took a breath. No one spoke. Then I reached the next part. The following decisions were made after much thought, prayer, and observation. My son leaned forward. Here it comes, his eyes said. Money. I looked up at them before reading the next line. I wanted them to see my face. I wanted them to remember this moment. Then I read. To my children and grandchildren, I leave exactly what I was given in my later years. They stared at me. My daughter frowned. What does that mean? She asked. I went on. Distance, silence, impatience, and absence. My granddaughter gasped. My son stood up. That's not fair, he snapped. I kept reading. I leave no house to those who spoke of it while I was still alive. I leave no money to those who counted it before I was gone. My daughter's face went pale. Mom, this isn't funny, she said sharply. I am not joking, I replied calmly. I turned the page. To those who treated me like a burden, I leave freedom from responsibility. You will no longer have to worry about me. My son slammed his hand on the table. So that's it, he shouted. You're punishing us. I looked at him. No, I said, I'm being honest. My granddaughter began to cry softly. My daughter shook her head. This is cruel, she said. I met her eyes. So is being ignored, I replied. I continued reading. To the people who showed up when they didn't have to, who listened without rushing, who helped without asking for anything in return. They all leaned forward now. Confused. Concerned. To those people, I read, I leave my gratitude, my home, and my legacy. Silence fell like a weight. My son's voice was barely controlled. You gave the house away, he asked. I nodded. Yes, I said. To who? My daughter demanded. I folded the paper carefully. You'll find out soon, I replied. My granddaughter looked up at me, tears in her eyes. But Grandma, what about us? She asked. That question hurt the most. I softened my voice. I gave you years of love, I said. That part was never written in a will. My son laughed bitterly. So we get nothing. I looked around the room. You got chances, I said, many of them. No one spoke for a long time. The envelope lay empty on the table. Their faces looked different now. Not excited. Not hopeful. Afraid. Because they realized something important. They had already lost me long before the will. My daughter finally whispered. You planned this. I nodded. I prepared, I said. As I stood up slowly, leaning on the arm of the chair, I felt something strange. Relief. For the first time in years, I had said everything I needed to say. But I wasn't done yet. Because the next pay, the final pay, would reveal exactly who would inherit everything. And when they heard that name, there would be no more pretending. Before I continue this story, kindly subscribe, like, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I did not rush to read the last page. I let the silence stretch. Because silence can speak louder than words when people are scared. My son paced the room, running his hands through his hair. My daughter sat stiff on the couch, her lips pressed together so tight they turned white. My grandchildren avoided my eyes. They were waiting. And for once, I was not in a hurry to please them. You can't just leave us hanging like this, my son said finally. I looked at him calmly. I waited years for you to notice me, I replied. You can wait a few minutes. That shut him up. I smoothed the paper with my fingers and began to read the final page. To the people who treated me like a person, even when I had nothing to offer. My daughter scoffed. "Mom, come on," she said. "We're your family." I looked up. "Family is a verb," I said, "not just a title." She looked away. I continued. To the ones who checked on me without being asked, who listened without rushing, who sat with me when I was scared. My granddaughter whispered. "Who is she talking about?" I ignored her. I read the next line slowly. "I leave my home, my savings, and my belongings to those who showed me dignity." My son exploded. "This is insane," he shouted. "You're letting strangers take everything we worked for." I met his eyes. "I worked for it," I corrected. "You waited for it." My hands trembled slightly as I reached the name. Not from fear. From the weight of what it meant. I looked at all of them one last time. Because after this, nothing would be the same. "To my neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Carter," I read, "who checked on me every morning for 6 years." My daughter gasped. "You gave the house to the lady next door," she cried. I nodded. "She saw me every day," I said, "not just when it was convenient." My son laughed harshly. "That woman isn't even blood," he snapped. I tilted my head. "She treated me better than blood," I replied. I continued reading. To the church volunteer, Mark Lewis, who carried my groceries, fixed what I could not, and never asked for a thing. My granddaughter shook her head in disbelief. "This has to be a joke," she said. I looked at her gently. "It's only a joke if you think kindness has no value," I said. My daughter stood up now, tears in her eyes. "So that's it," she said. "You're choosing them over us." I took a deep breath. "No," I said softly. "You chose yourselves a long time ago." The room filled with voices. Accusations. Crying. Anger. "You're doing this to hurt us. You're embarrassed us. You'll regret this." I let them speak. Because this was the sound of people realizing the truth too late. Finally, my son pointed at me and said something that cut deeper than anything else. "You're being selfish." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I smiled sadly. "I was selfless my whole life," I said. "This is the first thing I've ever done for myself." That quieted him. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back into the envelope. "This will is final," I said. "It has been signed and witnessed." My daughter's voice shook. "You didn't even tell us," she said. I nodded. "You didn't ask how I was," I replied. My granddaughter began to sob openly now. "I didn't mean it like that, Grandma," she said. I reached for her hand. "I believe you," I said, "but belief does not erase neglect." I stood up slowly, leaning on my cane. "I'm tired," I said. "This meeting is over." My son stepped toward me. "You can't do this," he said. I looked at him calmly. "I already did," I replied. They left one by one. Doors slammed. Voices echoed outside. The house felt empty, but lighter. I sat alone in my chair that night, staring at the envelope on the table. I thought I would feel guilty. I didn't. I felt honest. But I did not sleep well, because I knew something was coming. People who feel entitled do not accept loss quietly. And my children were not done yet. Not by a long shot. The next morning, my phone rang before the sun came up. It was my son. His voice was low. Controlled. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk. This isn't over." I closed my eyes. "I know," I replied. And as I ended the call, I realized something chilling. The will didn't just change their future. It changed how dangerous the present might become. Before I continue this story, kindly subscribe, like, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The call from my son stayed in my chest long after I put the phone down. This isn't over. Those words followed me from room to room like a shadow. I made tea and sat at the table, staring at the steam as it rose and disappeared. My hands were steady, but my heart was not. I had told the truth, yes. I had done what was right for me, but truth has a way of waking up people who do not like to be exposed. And my children had never liked being told no. By mid-morning, my doorbell rang. I didn't answer right away. I looked through the window first. It was my daughter. Alone. That worried me more than if she had come angry. I opened the door slowly. She smiled, but her eyes were tight. "Mom," she said softly, "can we talk?" I stepped aside. She walked in like she still owned the place. She sat on the couch and sighed. "You scared everyone last night," she said. "I told the truth," I replied. She shook her head. "You embarrassed us," she said. I sat across from her. "You embarrassed yourselves," I said gently. That made her eyes flash. She leaned forward. "Mom, you don't understand how this looks," she said. "People will talk." I nodded. "They already were," I replied. She froze. "What do you mean?" I met her eyes. "About how rarely you visit. About how you only come around when something is needed." Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked away. "This isn't about that," she said quickly. "This is about family." I let the words sit between us. "Family doesn't count money before the body is cold," I said quietly. She flinched. "That's not fair," she whispered. I leaned back. "Neither was being forgotten," I replied. She stood up suddenly. "So you're really doing this?" she asked. "Giving everything away?" "I'm giving it to people who saw me," I said. Her voice shook. "You'll regret this," she said. I looked at her. "I regret wasting years begging for attention," I said. "Not this." She left without hugging me. The door closed harder than necessary. I sat alone again. But not for long. By afternoon, the phone started ringing. My son. My daughter. Even an old cousin I hadn't heard from in years. I didn't answer. Not a single one. Because when people smell money leaving their reach, they suddenly remember how to speak. The next day, my neighbor Evelyn came over. She held my hand and said, "You okay, Rosie?" I smiled. "I am now," I said. She squeezed my hand. "They're angry," she said carefully. "I know," I replied. She nodded. "Be careful," she said. That word stayed with me. That evening, I noticed something strange. My front gate was open. I never leave it open. I checked the locks. They were fine. But my chest tightened. Because something felt off. The following morning, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No stamp. No return address. Inside was a note. "You've gone too far." That was all it said. My hands trembled. Not from fear. From realization. They were not done. I sat down slowly and read the note again. I thought of every sacrifice I had made. Every meal skipped. Every dream delayed. And now, because I finally chose myself, I was being warned. I called Evelyn. Then I called the church. Then I called the lawyer who helped me prepare the will. "I think my family is getting desperate," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then you did the right thing," he replied. "Desperation shows truth." That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me sit up. Every shadow felt heavier. But fear did not win. It never would again. Early the next morning, there was a knock at the door. Hard. Urgent. I looked through the window. It was my son. And he was not alone. Two men stood behind him. Strangers. My heart dropped into my stomach. He looked up and met my eyes. His face was calm. Too calm. "Mom," he called through the door. "We need to talk, right now." I did not move. I did not answer. Because whatever came next was no longer just about a will. It was about how far entitlement would go when it felt threatened. Before I continue this story, kindly subscribe, like, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I did not open the door. I stood there, my hand resting on the back of the chair, listening to my heartbeat loud in my ears. The knocking came again. Harder this time. "Mom," my son called, his voice sharp. "Stop this nonsense and open the door." Behind him, the two men shifted their weight. I could see their shadows through the frosted glass. They were not family. They were not neighbors. They stood too close, too comfortable. That scared me more than the knocking. I took a slow breath. I reminded myself of something important. I had lived 76 years. I had raised children alone. I had buried a husband. I had survived sickness, hunger, and loneliness. I was not a weak woman. But I was careful. "Go home," I called through the door. My voice was steady. "You can't ignore us forever," my son replied. "I'm not ignoring you," I said. "I'm choosing peace." One of the men laughed softly. That sound chilled me. "Mom," my son said again, lowering his voice, "you're making a mistake." I closed my eyes. I had heard those words my whole life. Every time I said no. Every time I chose rest. Every time I spoke up. Mistake was their word for disobedience. "You need to leave," I said. There was silence. Then footsteps. They walked away. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then I slowly peeked through the window. They were gone. But the feeling did not leave with them. I locked every door. Every window. I pulled the curtains closed. Then I sat down and let my hands shake. Not because I regretted my choice, but because I finally understood something clearly. My children were not just angry. They were desperate. And desperation can make people dangerous. That afternoon, Evelyn came over again. I told her everything. Her face went pale. "They brought strangers?" she asked. I nodded. "That's not right," she said firmly. "No," I replied, "it's not." She took my hands. "You're staying with me tonight," she said. "This isn't up for discussion." For once, I did not argue. At Evelyn's house, the air felt safer. But my mind did not rest. I replayed my son's face over and over. The calm anger. The confidence. Like he believed I would eventually give in. He always believed that. That night, I dreamed of my children when they were small. Running through this same neighborhood. Calling my name. Needing me. I woke up crying. Because somewhere along the way, love turned into entitlement. The next morning, I called my lawyer. "I think my family is trying to pressure me," I said. He sighed. "You're not the first," he replied. That sentence made my stomach twist. "They think you'll fold," he continued. "That guilt will bring you back in line." I nodded. "They don't know me anymore," I said. He paused. "Then we take precautions," he replied. Over the next few days, things escalated quietly. My phone filled with messages. Some kind. Some angry. Some threatening. "You owe us. You're tearing the family apart. People will say terrible things about you." I read them all. I did not respond. One message stood out. From my son. "You won't like how this ends." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I turned my phone off. I stayed with Evelyn for a week. During that time, neighbors began whispering. My daughter had been talking. Telling people I was confused. That I wasn't thinking clearly. That I was being manipulated. The old story. The tired one. When women don't obey, they must be unwell. One afternoon, a woman from church pulled me aside. "Your daughter says you're not okay. she said gently. I smiled. I've never been clearer, I replied. She studied my face, then nodded slowly. I believe you, she said. That meant more than she knew. But the pressure did not stop. Letters began arriving. Not legal ones. Emotional ones. Photos from the past. Old birthday cards. Notes saying remember when. They were trying to soften me. Confuse me. Pull me back into guilt. I sat with those memories. I honored them. But I did not let them rewrite the present. Because love that only appears when money is involved is not love. It's hunger. One evening, as Evelyn and I sat watching television, the doorbell rang. We froze. She muted the sound. Don't move, she whispered. We watched through the window. It was my daughter. Alone this time. No men. No anger. Just tears. She looks broken, Evelyn said softly. I swallowed. I know, I replied. But broken does not mean innocent. I stepped forward and opened the door slightly. What do you want? I asked. My daughter's face crumpled. Mom, she cried, please, this has gone too far. I said nothing. She stepped closer. You raised us better than this, she said. I felt the sting. You're right, I replied. I did. She wiped her tears. Then why are you doing this? She asked. I looked at her carefully. Because I finally learned the lesson you forgot, I said. And what's that? She whispered. That love is shown, I replied, not assumed. She shook her head. We need that house, she said suddenly. There it was. The truth. I smiled sadly. You don't need it, I said. You want it. She froze. You're choosing strangers over us, she said angrily. No, I replied. I'm choosing respect. She laughed bitterly. Then don't come crying when you're alone, she said. I looked around Evelyn's warm home. I thought of the people who checked on me, who sat with me, who saw me. I'm not alone, I said. She left. That night, I made a decision. Not about the will. That was already done. I decided something deeper. I would stop explaining myself. The next morning, I returned to my house. With company. Evelyn came. So did Mark from church. So did another neighbor. Not as protection. As witnesses. When we arrived, I saw something that made my knees weak. The garden I loved had been torn up. Flowers crushed. Soil scattered. Like someone had kicked through it in anger. Evelyn gasped. Oh my God, she whispered. My heart ached. But something else rose inside me. Resolve. Inside the house, nothing was stolen. But drawers had been opened. Papers moved. Someone had searched. Looking for something. Proof. Or leverage. I sat down slowly. They're getting bolder, Mark said quietly. Yes, I replied. But they're also running out of moves. That night, as I sat in my chair, staring at the broken garden outside, my phone buzzed. One final message from my son. If you don't fix this, we will. I did not reply. I simply turned the phone face down. Because the truth was clear now. The will did not make them cry because of money. It made them cry because it exposed who they had become. And the next move would decide everything. Before I continue this story, kindly subscribe, like, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The garden stayed broken for days. I didn't rush to fix it. Every crushed flower felt like a message. Not just anger. Ownership. Like they were reminding me that they believed everything I had was already theirs. I stood by the window each morning, looking at the torn soil, and felt something heavy settle inside my chest. Not fear. Clarity. I had spent most of my life cleaning up after other people's emotions, after their messes, after their mistakes, after their disappointments. But this mess, I let it sit. Because sometimes you need to see the damage clearly before you decide what to do next. Word spread fast, faster than I expected. People noticed my children coming around more. People noticed the raised voices. People noticed the strangers. One afternoon, a neighbor I barely knew stopped me while I was checking my mail. "Rosalind," she said carefully, "are you okay?" I looked at her face. Really looked. Concern, real concern. "I am," I replied. She nodded. "If you ever need anything," she said, "I live 2 houses down." I thanked her, and something inside me softened. Because kindness shows up quietly. It doesn't demand inheritance. That evening, my phone rang again. My son. I didn't answer. He called again. And again. Finally, I picked up. "What?" I asked. "You're enjoying this," he said sharply. I almost laughed. "No," I replied. "I'm surviving it." He sighed loudly. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said. I closed my eyes. "I understand perfectly," I replied. "You're angry because you lost control." Silence. Then his voice dropped. "You always liked playing the victim," he said. That one hurt. Because it came from someone I once rocked to sleep. "I never played anything," I said quietly. "I lived it." He scoffed. "You think people will believe you?" he asked. I smiled sadly. "They already do," I replied. And I hung up. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was scared, but because my mind kept returning to one question. How did love turn into this? I thought back to when my children were young. When they held my hand crossing the street. When they called for me in the night. When my approval meant everything. Somewhere along the way, gratitude faded. And entitlement took its place. Not overnight, but gradually. Like rust. The next morning, Evelyn came over with coffee. "You look tired," she said. "I am," I replied. She sat across from me and said something I didn't expect. "You know," she said slowly, "they're trying to scare you." I nodded. "Yes," I said. "And it's not working," she added. I smiled. "No," I said, "it's not." Later that day, Mark from church stopped by. He looked uncomfortable. "I heard something," he said. My stomach tightened. "What?" I asked. He hesitated. "Your daughter been telling people you're confused," he said gently, "that you don't know what you signed." I exhaled slowly. There it was. The next move. I wasn't surprised. When women stop obeying, the story always changes. We're not strong. We're sick. We're not decisive. We're manipulated. It's easier to question a woman's mind than face her truth. That evening, I called a small meeting. Not with family. With people who knew me. Evelyn. Mark. 2 women from church. The neighbor down the street. We sat in my living room. I told them everything. Not angrily. Clearly. Dates. Words. Events. They listened. No interruptions. No excuses. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then one of the women spoke. "You're not confused," she said firmly. "You're brave." Another nodded. "We see you," she said. That was all I needed. The next day, something unexpected happened. My granddaughter showed up alone. She stood at the door, twisting her hands. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. I stepped aside. She sat on the couch, looking smaller than I remembered. "I didn't know," she said suddenly. "Know what?" I asked. "How bad it was," she replied. "How lonely you were." I said nothing. She swallowed hard. They talk about money all the time, she continued. It made me uncomfortable. I watched her closely. Truth sounds different when it's real. I don't want the house, she said quickly. I just want you. My chest tightened. Then show up, I said gently. She nodded, tears filling her eyes. I will, she whispered. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope. Not for reconciliation, but for honesty. That night, as I locked the door, I noticed something new. A car parked across the street. Engine running. Lights off. I froze. I watched. After a few minutes, it drove away. My heart pounded. I knew then. This was not over. My children were losing more than money. They were losing control. And people who lose control often make reckless choices. I sat at my table and opened my notebook again. I added a new page. If anything happens to me, this is what led here. Not out of fear. Out of truth. Before bed, I checked the garden one last time. The crushed flowers were still there. But between the broken stems, I noticed something. New shoots. Small. Green. Pushing through the soil. Life. I smiled softly. Because even when people try to destroy what you grow, life finds a way back. As I turned to go inside, my phone buzzed. One message. From my son. Tomorrow, we're settling this, one way or another. I stared at the screen, then looked up at the dark sky. Tomorrow. The word felt heavy. Because tomorrow would decide whether they accepted the truth or tried to force a different ending. I locked the door and prepared myself. I woke up before the sun, not because I was afraid, but because my body knew something important was coming. That word my son used, tomorrow, had settled deep inside me. It wasn't a threat shouted in anger. It was calm, planned, and that made it more dangerous. I lay still in bed, listening to the house breathe. This house had held every version of me. The young mother, the tired widow, the quiet woman who learned to disappear. Today, it would hold the woman who refused to shrink again. I made breakfast slowly. Not because I was relaxed, but because rushing would mean panic had won. I cracked the eggs carefully, toasted the bread, poured my tea. I did everything with intention, because control does not always come from power. Sometimes it comes from calm. At exactly 9 a.m, my phone rang. My daughter. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. Mom, she said, her voice too polite, we need to meet. I didn't ask why. I'm home, I replied. There was a pause. We're coming over, she said. Way. I already knew who that meant. They arrived together. My son. My daughter. And my son-in-law. No strangers this time. This was family business now. I opened the door before they knocked. They looked surprised. Good. We sat in the living room. The same room where they once played on the floor. The same room where they now wanted control. My son didn't waste time. This has gone far enough, he said. I folded my hands in my lap. Yes, I replied, it has. My daughter leaned forward. You're letting people fill your head with nonsense, she said. I tilted my head. Which people? I asked. She hesitated. That neighbor, those church folks, they don't know us like we do. I smiled sadly. They know how I'm treated, I replied. That's enough. My son-in-law finally spoke. You're tearing the family apart, he said. I looked at him carefully. No, I replied. I stopped holding it together alone. That silenced him. My son slammed his hand on the arm of the chair. Enough, he shouted. You think you can just rewrite everything. I met his eyes. I already did, I said. His jaw tightened. You owe us, he said. That word again. Oh. I leaned forward slightly. I gave you my youth, I said quietly. My strength. My silence. My forgiveness. They stared at me. I owe you nothing, I continued, and that is the truth you can't accept. My daughter began to cry. Not softly. Loudly. I just wanted security, she sobbed. Is that so wrong? I watched her carefully. No, I said gently, but stealing it from someone else is. My son stood up. So this is it, he asked. You're choosing strangers over blood. I shook my head. I'm choosing behavior over titles, I replied. That made him laugh bitterly. You think people will remember you kindly after this? He asked. I smiled. They already do, I said. He leaned closer. You're making enemies, he warned. I didn't move. I already survived being ignored, I replied. Enemies are easier than silence. The room grew still. This was the moment. The one where people decide whether to accept truth or try to bend it. My daughter wiped her face. If you don't change this, she said quietly, we'll tell everyone you're not well. There it was. The final card. I felt a wave of sadness. Not fear. Sadness. I reached into the drawer beside my chair and pulled out my notebook. I placed it on the table. Read, I said. My son frowned. What is this? He asked. Everything, I replied. He flipped through the pages. Dates. Notes. Messages copied down word for word. His face changed with every page. You kept records, he asked. Yes, I said, because I knew one day you'd say I imagined it. My daughter's hands trembled. This is manipulation, she said weakly. No, I replied, this is memory. I reached for another envelope. This, I said calmly, goes to people I trust if anything happens to me. Silence dropped like a stone. My son swallowed. You wouldn't, he said. I already have, I replied. They stood up slowly. The fight drained out of them. Because they realized something important. I was no longer alone. And I was no longer quiet. At the door, my son turned back. You think this makes you strong? He asked. I met his eyes. No, I said. Surviving you did. They left. No shouting. No slamming doors. Just the sound of control slipping away. I locked the door and leaned against it. My legs shook. But my heart did not. That evening, Evelyn came over. You okay? She asked. I nodded. They tried, I said. And, she asked. They failed, I replied. But as night fell, something uneasy settled in my chest. Because people who fail once often try again. And tomorrow, the truth would no longer be quiet. It would be visible, public, and irreversible. As I turned off the lights, my phone buzzed one last time. A message from an unknown number. You've embarrassed the wrong people. I stared at it, then deleted it. Because embarrassment fades. But truth does not. Tomorrow, everything would change. And there would be no going back. Before I continue this story, kindly subscribe, like, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The truth does not explode. It spreads. Like water finding cracks. By the next morning, I could feel it in the air. People were watching differently. Listening differently. Whispers followed me down the sidewalk, not cruel ones, not curious ones, but cautious ones. The kind people use when they realize a story they thought they knew was wrong. I had not said anything publicly, but I didn't need to. My children had done that for me. My daughter's plan backfired faster than she expected. When she told people I was confused, she assumed they would nod and move on. But instead, they asked questions. And questions have a way of pulling threads loose. At the grocery store, a woman from church stopped me. "Rosalind," she said softly, "are you okay?" I smiled. "I am," I replied. She hesitated. "Your daughter said you were struggling," she added. I met her eyes calmly. "Struggling people don't keep detailed journals," I said gently. Her eyebrows lifted. "Oh," she said quietly. That was all it took. Later that day, Mark called. "They're asking around," he said. "Who?" I asked. "Everyone," he replied, "and people aren't buying the story." I nodded. Truth doesn't need selling. It just needs space. By afternoon, my son called. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. "Mom, this is getting out of hand," he said. "People are talking." I smiled faintly when I heard it. That was the part he feared most. Not loss. Not guilt. Exposure. That evening, I attended church for the first time in weeks. I sat quietly in my usual seat. People greeted me kindly. No pity. No suspicion. Just respect. That told me everything. After the service, the pastor pulled me aside. "I've heard some concerns," he said carefully. I nodded. "So have I replied. He studied my face. "You seem very clear," he said. "I am," I replied. He smiled. "That's what I thought," he said. The next day, something unexpected happened. My granddaughter called. Not crying. Not angry. Just quiet. "Grandma," she said, "can we meet?" "Yes," I replied. She came alone. She looked tired. Older than her years. We sat at the same kitchen table where I had once cried alone. "I didn't know they were saying those things," she said. I nodded. "I know," I replied. She swallowed hard. "They told me you were being influenced," she said. "And what do you think now?" I asked. She looked around the room. At the photos. The furniture. The memories. "I think you're tired of being invisible," she said. I smiled softly. "That's a good way to put it," I replied. She reached across the table and took my hand. "I don't want the house," she said. "I just don't want to lose you." I squeezed her hand. "Then don't," I said. That was the first honest moment we'd shared in years. Outside my family, the tone shifted quickly. People stopped asking what I had done. They started asking why. And when they looked closer, the answers were uncomfortable. My daughter felt it first. Friends stopped returning calls. Invitations slowed. People listened politely, but no longer agreed automatically. She was used to control. She was not used to doubt. My son felt it harder. At work, someone asked casually, "So, what's going on with your mom?" He laughed it off. But laughter doesn't erase curiosity. One afternoon, my neighbor came running over. "You won't believe this," she said. "What?" I asked. "Your son was arguing with someone outside the coffee shop," she said. "About you." I sighed. "He always did struggle with being questioned," I said. That night, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I answered. "This is your son-in-law," the voice said stiffly. I closed my eyes. "Yes," I replied. "We need to end this," he said. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "It's already ending," I replied. "You're ruining their lives," he snapped. I took a breath. "No," I said calmly. "I stopped lying to protect them." He scoffed. "You think people care about an old woman's feelings?" he asked. I smiled. "They care about integrity," I replied. "And right now they're watching." Silence. Then the line went dead. The following days were strange. Quiet, but not peaceful. Like the moment after a storm, when debris settles. I received letters. Some supportive. Some angry. One anonymous note read, "You should have kept family matters private." I laughed softly. "They stopped being private when I stopped mattering," I said aloud. My children did not come by again. Not together. Not separately. The pressure had shifted. They were no longer attacking. They were retreating. One morning, Evelyn brought me the newspaper. She pointed to a small community section. "There," she said. I read it. A short piece about elder respect. About listening. About dignity. No names mentioned. But the timing was not a coincidence. I folded the paper carefully. "I didn't ask for this," I said. "No," Evelyn replied, "but you earned it." That afternoon, I returned to the garden. The broken flowers were gone. New ones had been planted. Evelyn and Mark had done it together. I stood there for a long time, because nothing symbolized this journey better than that. Damage, then care, then growth. As the sun set, my phone buzzed one last time. A message from my son. "We didn't think it would go this far." I stared at the words, then typed a single reply. "Neither did I, until you pushed." I turned the phone off, because the truth was now bigger than us. It had moved beyond the house, beyond the family, into the world. And tomorrow, the final chapter would begin. Not with shouting, not with punishment, but with truth finally settling where it belongs. The world did not end the day my children stopped calling. It didn't even shake. The sun still rose. Birds still sang. The kettle still boiled. But something inside me finally rested. For the first time in years, I was not waiting for the phone to ring. Not bracing myself for disappointment. Not rehearsing what I would say to keep the peace. Peace no longer needed keeping. It had arrived. I woke up early that morning, not from worry, but from habit. I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to the quiet, real quiet, not the tense kind that comes before an argument, but the calm kind that feels earned. I stood slowly, stretched my back, and whispered to myself, "You did it." Not because I had defeated anyone, but because I had finally stopped fighting myself. I went into the kitchen and made breakfast the way I liked it. No rush, no apologies for taking too long. I ate by the window, watching the new flowers in the garden sway gently in the breeze. They were growing, despite everything. So was I. Later that morning, Evelyn came by with fresh bread. She smiled and said, "You look lighter." I nodded. "I put something down," I replied. She didn't ask what. She already knew. Over the next few weeks, the noise faded. The whispers slowed. The tension dissolved. The story settled. People moved on to other things, as people always do. But something important stayed. Respect. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that shows up in how people look at you. How they listen. How they wait. My daughter tried once more. She sent a message. "I hope you're happy." I read it carefully. Then I replied, "I am at peace." That was the last message we ever exchanged. And for the first time, it did not hurt. My son never reached out again. I heard things through others. That he was angry. That he was embarrassed. That he blamed everyone but himself. That was his journey. Not mine. My granddaughter stayed. She came by every Sunday. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we didn't. She helped me water the garden. She listened more than she spoke. One afternoon, she said softly, "I didn't know adults could be wrong like that." I smiled sadly. "They can," I said, "and they can also change if they want to." She nodded. "I want to," she said. That mattered. As months passed, I began doing small things I had put off for years. I joined a morning walking group. I signed up for a writing circle the community center. I started telling my story in pieces, not to shame anyone, but to breathe. One day, a woman approached me after a meeting. "I feel invisible in my own family," she said. I took her hand. "So did I replied. And in that moment, I understood something important. This was never just about a will. It was about voice. I had spent decades being useful instead of being heard, helpful instead of being valued, present instead of being seen. And the moment I stopped giving without receiving respect, the illusion shattered. People thought the will would make them rich. It didn't. It made them face themselves. And that is far more painful than losing money. I never raised my voice. I never called the police. I never dragged anyone to court. I simply stopped lying, stopped shrinking, stopped protecting people who would not protect me. And when I did, everything changed. On my 77th birthday, I sat in my living room surrounded by people who chose to be there. Not because of what I owned, but because of who I was. Evelyn brought cake. Mark brought flowers. My granddaughter brought a handmade card. I felt full. Not of things. Of truth. That night, as I prepared for bed, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. Older. Yes. But stronger than I had ever been. I smiled and said out loud, "You're free." And I meant it. If there is one thing I want you to remember from my story, it is this. Love that counts your possessions before your pain is not love. Family that waits for your silence does not deserve it. And choosing yourself is not betrayal. It is survival. I am Rosalind Booker. I am 76 years old. And I did not die quietly. I lived honestly. And that made all the difference. If this story touched you, please subscribe, like, and turn on the notification bell for more emotional stories like this. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Somewhere out there, I might be reading.